Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we are once again updating the power rankings for Survivor 43 following episode 10. And this was a pretty interesting episode, not so much for the boot itself, but more so how they played around with the editing to a degree, and also my expectations throughout this episode were not exactly what the episode was intending, but we'll get into that in a moment. But there are 8 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 8, we have the boot from this week, and here we have Noel. And I'll be honest, even though the episode itself made it pretty clear that it was going to be a Noel boot from pretty early on, I actually didn't think Noel was going to be the boot here, as if we were going based off 41 and 42, the final 8 was normally a time in the game where they took out a big player. And with Jesse getting some content early on about him talking about how big of a position he was in, and there just being little hints that there could have been a Jesse blindside here, I actually thought that all this stuff that we got for Noel was a misdirect. And I'll probably talk about that a bit more when I get into Jesse and Cody and some of these other people, but I really thought that Noel was not going to be the boot here, even with the signs pointing in that direction. But in the end, it was a pretty standard Noel boot, where she got a pretty noticeable visibility spike. She obviously got some pretty good content, like her winning the reward challenge, and then her really trying to spearhead this move against Carla after the immunity challenge, only for that to come out short and for her to be taken out here due to her being a threat. And all things considered, I think Noel played about as well as she could have given the circumstances. There weren't that many points where she was in the majority alliance. Obviously early on she loses Justine right away. She's in part of this duo with Dwight, and had NECA not been someone who was targeted for being a challenge weakness, there was a very good chance that either her or Dwight would have been the boot there, so that's not particularly great. And even at the merge, while she is part of the majority for certain votes, she wasn't really in the driver's seat, and it really wasn't until that double tribal where she was able to put a move on her resume. Now, obviously, her move to use the vote steal in order to make James feel comfortable so that he doesn't use his knowledge as power is a pretty effective use of the vote steal, and I think that really shows Noel's potential as a player. But obviously, I feel like threat management was another key issue for her, where she was targeted soon thereafter. And admittedly, I'm not entirely sure if it was in the best interest of people like Jesse to take out Noel in this spot, but I feel like her being seen as this big threat was an issue that she was going to deal with down the line. As I even said last week, that I felt like her edit was being set up for her to be this endgame threat. And I feel like she's someone who probably would have won a jury vote had she gotten to the end. But the problem was that people recognized that, and people struck at her pretty early on. So while Noel didn't play a great game per se, I don't think she's the worst player in the world, and I did feel like that vote steal play at the double tribal was pretty impressive. But at the end of the day, I never felt like she was actually going to win the game, so because of that, she is here at number 8. And with that, there are 7 players left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely they are to win, based on our edit and current game position. But at number 7, and this may seem like an overreaction, but really I see it as a long time coming. But at number 7, the player I believe is the least likely to win Survivor 43 at this point is Sami. And for me, this episode was the breaking point. I feel like at this point, there is 0 chance that Sami wins this game. Where I feel like this episode really highlighted that no one really respects Sami, despite the fact that he's playing this middle position for a lot of it, where he was called on multiple times for him playing the middle and people not seeming to respect that. I mean, he really comes off as this player who is overly self-interested, and yes, you could see that as a way of people targeting him, but really it gives out the impression that they just don't really feel like targeting him, and they probably feel like he's someone that they could beat at the end. And Sami himself never gets an opportunity to defend himself, where obviously he has taken on the reward, and this should be a pretty good moment for the people taken on there, where they get pretty good personal content talking about their family, and we do see that for literally everyone else except for Sami, where Sami's content with his family is really abbreviated, and he really tries to get into game talks here, only for that to not really be reciprocated. And in general, I feel like Sami didn't really get to answer for a lot of the accusations slung at him. The episode really seemed to bury him. And I feel like while this episode itself wasn't the worst thing in the world for Sami, I feel like the accumulation of knocks across the entire season has really solidified that he's probably not going to win. Where I always had some issues with Sami's edit, even for the premiere, where I felt like he was sort of undercutting himself at certain points. And while we did see plenty of positivity and him getting established his storyline about how he wants to be the youngest winner and how he wants to be underestimated, I feel like those knocks were still something that was percolating in the back of my mind and not really something that I could really use to disqualify him. But I don't know. I feel like as the weeks went on and on, I started to return to my preseason assessment of him as this player who could make it to the end, kind of like a Xander, but not really have the respect to win. And while I feel like he's played a more active game than someone like a Xander, he's also someone who, at this point, has clearly shown that his gameplay is not being respected, and he's probably more in line with someone like a Sash from Nicaragua or an Albert from South Pacific. You know, this player who comes off as very strategic. And yes, while Sami may not come off as his used car salesman, sort of like a Sash, for example, he's still someone whose level of self-interest and the way he's open about how self-interested he's playing and how blatantly he's playing the middle isn't translating to people being impressed by him. And I feel like that's his critical flaw and the thing that will cost him the game at the end. And I feel like with the accumulation of all these things, plus the fact that we are starting to see more of this negativity, which I did sort of foresee, but now we are seeing it play out. I feel like at this point, I am fully confident that Sami is going to get to the end of the game. He's going to get the final tribal, and he's just not going to have the respect to win the game. And at this point, this episode was sort of the breaking point for me. Now, I'm sure some people will feel like that I probably should have pegged him down sooner, as I did recognize these flaws from earlier on and probably should have punished him more for those flaws from earlier on. But I feel like now, with everything that we've been seeing, I just feel confident that he's not winning. And it's about time that I reflect that in my power ranking. And it's for that reason that I have him here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we have another player that I have very little faith in winning the game, but I feel like they got a bit more positivity within this episode. But here we have Owen. And Owen's not winning the game either. I've already gone through in the past his critical flaws and that he doesn't really seem to have this central storyline. And it's really funny how he continues to vote incorrectly, where he just continually fails to get on the bus. Where, yes, the plan was to split the vote on Carla, but the fact that he's part of the Carla split is pretty funny there. Again, just his inability to actually vote out the person that gets taken out is still pretty funny. And with all those things, I don't really feel like he's winning the game. But he did get a bit more positivity in this episode. He did get to go on the reward and get to talk about his family. And yes, while that is purely circumstantial content, I feel like it's a bit more positive content than what we got from Sami here, which is why I did give him the bump this week. And for that reason, he is here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5. And this is a weird placement as well. But here we have Gabler. And Gabler is really funny to think about. I mean, the fact that he's still in the game and probably going to get towards the end at this point is pretty funny to consider, but he's continuing to get some positive content, which could potentially lead into a win. Now, do I think Gabler's going to win? Probably not. I feel like there are other contenders that are a bit more likely than him. And I still feel like there are some issues with this game that could eventually crop up towards the end, particularly with how he has been presented as a loose candidate at points. Even though I don't think he's played that chaotically and that he's actually sort of made some good moves, but again, I feel like they could have been propped up a bit more. And he does get some setup here where he does briefly mention how Jesse is flipping the game, and that did sort of lead into this thought that maybe Jesse could be taken out in this round. But obviously that didn't go through, and he does eventually at least go along with the plan in voting out Noel here. So, admittedly, I'm still not that confident Gabler winning the game, but I feel like compared to Sami and Owen, I feel like he has more of a case to win based on his edit. I feel like he's gotten a bit more propped up at certain points, so at least there's that, but realistically, I don't think he's a particularly likely winner either. So because of that, he is here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this is another pretty weird placement, as on paper, this player had a pretty big presence throughout the episode, and got a pretty decent amount of credit for the Noel boot. However, I just feel like they're being set up for a downfall here. But here we have Jesse. And I'll say it straight up, I thought Jesse was going home here. I mean, for a number of reasons. For one, there's the whole precedent that I mentioned earlier, where again, this is the final 8, where which at least based on 41 and 42 was a point in the game where we saw a big player being taken out. On 41, that was the round where Shan got taken out, a big player. And in 42, we had Kai being taken out the final 8. And I feel like with 43, based on the meta that we've been seeing with this new era of Survivor, where we would see these players waiting until after the split tribal and a bit later in the game to make their move and to take out a big player. And I felt like Jesse was a particularly likely target of such a plan. And even with this edit throughout the episode, there were definitely signs of him potentially being taken out here, despite Noel's visibility spike and despite her like being presented as the pretty clear target for a lot of the episode. You have Jesse's confessional right at the beginning where he's talking about how he has all these advantages and how he's in this great position, which again screamed arrogance to me. And yes, while he wasn't undercut again until towards the very end of the episode dedicated so much time to setting up the Noel boot with him back at camp, literally going through step by step how to pull off a big move, even using freeze frames, which the fact that we're seeing freeze frames on Survivor was pretty weird itself. Obviously, we did see freeze frames way back in Survivor China during certain challenges, but the fact that we're seeing them again here was just so bizarre to me. And we're seeing text on the screen with Jesse literally outlining step by step him approaching the people that he needs to in order to blindside Noel here. And yes, while it is pretty impressive that Jesse was getting all this content and all this credit for this move, again, I felt like it was going to be a misdirect here. I felt like this was going to be a setup for Jesse to be taken out here, especially with that confessional towards the beginning. And another thing, and I'll talk about this more when I talk about Cody, the fact that Cody didn't get that much content in this episode made me think that Jesse was going to be the boot and that they were simply shielding Cody from this big move against him. And with me thinking Cody was a particularly likely winner candidate, that they would want to shield Cody while Jesse was taking all the heat, and that they wouldn't want to make it so obvious that Noel was going to be the boot here. So those were all elements that made me think that this was going to be a misdirect, that despite Noel having these signs of her being the boot, with her getting this massive visibility spike when she hasn't been that big of a presence throughout the season, that Jesse was going to be taken out here, and that this was going to set up some future storyline of Cody being an underdog and him having to claw his way back. I mean, there were signs that Jesse was going to be the boot here for me, but obviously that was not what happened here. It was more straightforward than I was giving it credit for. Noel was the boot here. However, even then, I still think the Jesse downfall is being set up, where we did see right before Tribal, Gabler talking about how Jesse was causing all this flipping to happen and that he was going to have something to do about it, which makes me think that Jesse could still go home in the next episode, which is obviously a pretty bad sign there. And just him getting so much content this episode and the episode going out of its way to highlight Jesse as his strategic threat could make Jesse the next boot, in my personal opinion. So I feel like with all that in mind, Jesse probably is not going to win the game at this point. And through that, I feel like I had to bump him down here based on this confidence that he'll be taken out sooner rather than later. So it's for all those reasons I did bump him down here, though to his credit, he did survive this round where I did think that he was going to be the boot, and I guess that was just me overthinking. But even so, I don't think he's going to win the game based on what we've seen up to this point and based on what I think is going to happen. So because of that, I do have him here at number 4. Now I'm moving on to number 3, and I feel like this top 3 is a little weird as I do have issues with each of these 3 people. And I feel like through that, any one of them could win at this point, or any one of these 3 could just be taken out. But at number 3, I did decide to go with Carla here. And I still have a lot of the same issues that I have with Carla, where I feel like she is someone who's being set up to be this obstacle to be taken out. That's the way I felt about her for a while now. And through that, I'm not entirely sure whether she can win the game or not. However, I feel like the more that I think about it, her edit across this post merge has not been that spectacular either. I feel like that's a bit of a worry in my eyes. So through that, I do question whether she can actually win the game or not. But I feel like compared to the other people that we talked about, I feel like she has more of a case to actually win the game than those people. I feel like she has more of a case to get to the end and win a jury vote than the people that we talked about. So I feel like based on that alone, I did decide to have her at least this high. Though realistically, I have enough reservations to where I can have her too much higher than number 3 here. Now moving on to number 2, and this person has continued to go back and forth in my mind. But here we have Cassidy. And it's sort of weird that I have Cassidy back in contention after I did drop her to a certain degree in the early post merge, where obviously her storyline for at least a few episodes was her wanting to take out Ryan, someone who was going right after her, and she did win that battle. Although I did question whether it would lead to any future storylines or whether that was just it for her. And admittedly, I'm not entirely sure where it's going. Where on one hand, she did have a pretty good episode. She did get the proper self up. She did get to win immunity in a spot where she probably would have gotten votes had she not won immunity, where the plan was to split the vote between Cassidy and Carla. So there's that. And plus, even outside of that, I feel like she's gotten some pretty good confessionals as well. Now, whether that is circumstantial or not remains to be seen. But Cassidy is someone that I can't really ignore too much. I feel like she is someone who maybe could win, but I feel like there's still not enough clarity over what her storyline is to where I could justify putting her at number 1. But with that said, she is at least a contender. I could see her winning the game more clearly than anyone else we've already talked about. So because of that, she is here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the player I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 43 at this point is Cody. Now, admittedly, this was not a very good episode for Cody, even though for a lot of it, I did think it was, where obviously he did not get that much content this episode. It really felt like they were trying to hide him to a certain degree, and considering that I felt like he was a top contender earlier on this season, I felt like that was largely because they were setting up a Jesse blindside here, where obviously Jesse was Cody's closest ally, which and losing Jesse at this point would be bad for Cody's game. So therefore, they wanted to hide the winner from what is essentially a bad moment within their game. And I felt like that kind of justified Cody's like lack of visibility in this episode for a lot of it. But then we get the tribal, and that's not what happens. Jesse not only stays, but gets all the credit for this Noel boot here. And sure, you could debate whether the Noel move was good enough for them, in that Noel would have been this shield for them moving forward, and someone who could have been more open to working with Cody and Jesse moving forward. And by cutting her at this point, they are essentially leaving themselves open to be taken out by Carla down the road. So obviously that is a concern there, so you could justify whether Cody's lack of visibility is still a good thing or not, or whether Jesse getting the credit is a good thing or not. But at the end of the day, I felt like it would have been better if Jesse were taken out here, considering the edit that Cody got. So I feel like that's a bit of a worry there. And I feel like that was a consideration for actually dropping Cody below number 1 this week. But realistically, compared to everyone else, I still feel like Cody has a pretty good case for winning the game. And I feel like we're going to have to see more in order to really verify whether it's necessary to drop Cody or not. As it would be one thing if Cody simply like is being set up for a downfall here along with Jesse. But again, we'll have to see what happens with Cody. But I feel like while this episode wasn't great for Cody, it's not really enough to drop him below number 1 for this week. So because of that, I do have him here at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, obviously, I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so stay tuned for that. I am also covering The Amazing Race 34 right now, as that is coming out, so stay tuned for coverage on that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to join in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that's the video. See ya.